Today, we're going to build our very own custom Spring Boot starter. And if you've been around building Spring Boot applications before, you've undoubtedly come across Spring Boot starters. If you head over to start.spring.io and you create a new application and you pick the web starter, you'll get this nice dependency, the Spring Boot starter web in your build file. And this contains all the transitive dependencies you might need, all of the auto configuration to get you up and running. These starters, along with auto configuration, really help us bootstrap our applications quickly. And so today we're going to take a look at how to create our own starter from scratch. Before we write some code, I want to take a look at the documentation so you have some information that you can come back to later and read if you want to. There is a section on starters. What are starters? I want to look at this section here that says what is in a name. It says all official starters follow a similar naming pattern, Spring Boot starter, whatever the name is, where star is the type of application. This is important because these are official starters. So you should not name your starter Spring Boot starter Dan, for instance. When we talk about creating our own starter, for example, a third-party starter project called third-party project, that would typically be named third-party project dash Spring Boot starter. So just to know that correlation, so you know that when you see a starter, is that something from the official Spring Boot team, or is this something that someone has created their own third-party starter? So there's also some really good information in here on the application starters, the ones that are out there. And if you're really just getting started and you don't need any outside dependencies, the one starter that you can include in your starter is Spring Boot Starter. This includes the auto configuration support, logging, and YAML. So there's also a section in the documentation for creating your own starter. This is what we're going to go through today, but this has a little bit more information. Talking about naming, we're going to go through some configuration keys, what the auto configuration module does, where you have to kind of put a file to read from this, and more. And there's also another explanation there on typically like how you might want to structure your application. We'll see. We're just going to create a single project today, but a lot of custom Spring Boot starters that you'll see out in the wild are really two projects, one for the auto configuration, one for the actual code. But we'll talk through it all. So to get started, we're going to be creating a Spring Boot starter after the JSON placeholder service. So I use this a lot in apps, and I thought this would be a pretty decent example of creating our own starter. I want to create a starter that basically I can just pull into a project. And if I need to go get 200 to-dos, I just include this client and boom, we're off and running. We have some to-dos to work with. So that's what we're going to create. Now to create that, I'm going to head over to start.spring.io. We're going to create a new Java project. We're going to use Maven, the latest version of Spring Boot at this time, which is 3.2.2. We're going to call the group dev.danvega.jps for JSON placeholder service. I didn't want to name it JSON placeholder service Spring Boot starter. That seems like a really long name, so I shortened it down to JPS. We're going to choose Java 21, and then you have to figure out what dependencies you need to make this work. As I said, we're going to kind of have everything in one single project. And so all I need is the web package, because in the web package, I'll get the REST client, and then I can call it to another service and use that to like serialize and deserialize whatever these types we're working with. So I think the web package is really all I need. So I'm going to go in here and say web. Then I'll go ahead and click generate. I will download this and I will open this up in my favorite IDE, IntelliJ Ultimate, but you can open it up in whatever text editor or IDE you're most productive in. So with that, let's write some code. All right, so we're going to get started with our application. Now, our Spring Boot starter is not going to be an application, so we actually don't need this main application class. I'm going to go ahead and delete that now. They are also going to get rid of the properties. We're not going to read in from properties. We are going to have custom properties, but those will be filled in by whatever application is using the starter. We'll set some defaults. We'll talk about that. So those are the two things I'm going to get rid of. Again, in the Palm, all I have right now is the Spring Boot starter web, and you can, whatever you need for your starter, you can kind of include those. So the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this build plugin. We don't need the Spring Boot Maven plugin. Again, we're just not going to use it here in this starter. So that's some kind of infrastructure plumbing. Let's go ahead and start building our application. So the first thing that I'm going to want is some properties to configure the JSON placeholder service. So I'm going to start with, and actually I thought this was going to be JPS, all directories. I don't need that. So let's get rid of that. Refactor. While we're here, I think I will go ahead and get rid of this test as well. That's not going to work. So in here, I'm going to create a new Java class. We're going to call this the JSON placeholder service properties. Now, anytime you're using configuration properties, it's a good idea to have some convention around it. I just kind of end mine in properties. You can name it whatever you want. So we are going to say that this is a configuration properties. And we are going to call it, the prefix is going to be JSON-placeholder-service. That looks good. And then we're just going to have a single property here. And I actually don't want this to be a class. I want this to be a record. And in this record, we're going to have a single property, which is base URL, right? Now, because we are going to use this base URL to call out to the JSON placeholder service. I want to set a default here. The reason I'm providing this URL as a configuration property is you can actually download the JSON placeholder service code, compile it, run it on your own local machine, and then it would be running at a different URL, right? I can imagine me at a conference and maybe the Wi-Fi doesn't work and I'm like, oh no, I don't have that service that I was going to use in my demo. Well, I could spin something up locally and change the URL in whatever application the demo app that I'm using. So I want to set a default URL. So I can use the @default value annotation and say that this is going to be the default value if one is not used. So now we're using the public URL. If somebody wants to override that in their own application, they can. So we're getting some red squigglies here. Normally we would go into the main application class and enable configuration properties. There is no main app class here. So what we're going to do is we need to create a configuration, an auto configuration class. So I'm going to go ahead and say new Java class. We're going to call this JSON placeholder service configuration. Yeah, that looks good. And we are going to go ahead and annotate this with @auto configuration. Again, the documentation that we were looking at earlier, this is something you want to go through to learn what we're going to do there. And then here is where I can say enable configuration properties and that JSON placeholder service properties that we just created. So far, so good. I'm going to get an instance of a logger in here. I'm also going to get those properties. I need those properties. And we'll get that through constructor injection. So now with that in place, this is going to be the class where I'm going to configure all of the beans that I might need in my application. So ultimately, this JSON placeholder service starter is going to talk to all the different endpoints on JSON placeholder service. There are things like to-dos and users and comments and photos and albums. I'm just going to configure one here today, and we can always come back and do more later. But I'm going to do the to-dos. So I'm going to come in here in the to-do package, and we're going to quickly create a record to represent a to-do. So let's go ahead and say to-do, and this is a record. And what is it? User ID, ID, string. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Yeah, that'll work for me. So now we have a to-do. So now what I need is a to-do client. I'm not going to call it to-do client though, because that seems pretty generic. You might have something like that in your own application. So I'm actually going to create a JPS to-do client. And this is going to be a class. And in here, we are going to do a couple of things. One, I'm going to get a logger. And then 2, I need a REST client. So I'm going to say private final REST client, REST client. And then in the constructor, we're not going to get an instance of this just yet. We need to, so normally in the past, I've basically got an instance of the default REST client by using REST client.builder. Here, what I want to say is REST client, and I want to get an instance of the REST client and then set this. So I would say this.REST client is equal to REST client. But right now, we don't have an instance of this bean. This is not going to work because we don't have a REST client in the application context yet. So what I want to do is go back to my configuration class and create a bean of type REST client. So I'm going to say REST client, and then what I'll do is get the REST client dot builder here. I'll call that builder. REST return the builder, set the base URL to whatever we get from the properties file. So the default is going to probably be what's getting set there. And then build a REST client. And so now with that REST client, we can go ahead and create a bean of type JPS to do client. So now I can say at bean. Oh, and whoops, I forgot the bean here. Bean. What is this not like? Okay, we will fix that in just a second. And then the other thing I want to do is go ahead and create the JPS to do client. JPS to do client, which is going to take in a REST client and then return the new JPS to do client. So we're getting some errors here because we're not, this kind of tripped me up the first time I did this. We're in an application, but we are not in an application, right? There's no main application class. All right, so we'll come back to this in a second. So if we don't have a main application class, then how does this auto configuration run? Well, there's actually a convention for making this work. This was different in previous versions of Spring Boot. You had a spring.factories file. Since Spring Boot 3, this has changed a little bit. So we need to go into resources. We're going to create a new directory. We're going to create one called meta.inf and then one called spring. And then in the Spring directory, I'm going to copy this. This is in the documentation. We are going to create a new file. So new file. And it's going to be that name, which is org.springframework.boot autoconfiguration.imports. And in here, we're going to point to anything that we want to go ahead and import for auto configuration. So I'm going to give that fully qualified class name. So I'm going to say dev.danvega.jps .json placeholder service configuration. And now that will go ahead and get picked up. So let's go ahead and let's just make sure Maven's reloaded. And we have all of our errors gone. Everything seems to look pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and just do a quick build. Make sure we have no build errors. I think we're good. So now the question becomes, how do I test this, right? Because I don't have a main application class. I can't even just run the app to like manually test it. Give it a just a, hey, let me kick the tires a little and see if everything's working. And if I don't have a main application class, like how can I write some tests? This is the one thing that kind of confused me as well. So what I want to do is actually go into my JPS to-do client, and I want to create a test for this. So let's create a test. We'll create this in here. And what we can do is we can get access to an application context runner. And this runner is going to say new application context runner. And then we can use the dot with configuration, right? Because we need some configuration. All right, let's actually give this a name, Dan. And then we need to pass in some configuration. So you can pass in configurations. We see there's a couple of these that we could use. But in this case, I want to say that I have to actually pass in a couple configurations. One is going to be this JSON placeholder service configuration. All right, so I want to say auto configuration dot, oh, that's the wrong one, I think. Auto configurations dot of. And in here, we are going to say that we want the JSON placeholder configuration service dot class. I also need to auto configure the REST client auto configuration, because remember, we have a bean of REST client that is basically the REST client.builder, which is an interface. There's a default implementation of that when Spring's auto configuration kicks in, but it doesn't in this case yet. So if we were to try to run this now, we'd have all kinds of issues there. So I'm going to say the REST client auto configuration .class. So now with this instance, we could do a couple of things. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste here. But now we can do something like this. We can say, hey, take the context runner, run it, and from there, I want to assert a couple things. One, that we have a bean called JSON placeholder REST client. And JSON, actually, I think I named this just REST client here. But actually, let's stick to what I have in the repo. So the way that I would have done that in the repo is I would have said bean, and the name is JSON placeholder REST client. I think this was to just prevent a default name of REST client because I use that in a lot of places. So going back to the test, now we want to make sure those two beans are in the application context. And if this passes, and it does, wow, that means we've done our job. And those beans, that auto configuration file is getting picked up because of this file, this import file that we have. It's getting picked up, run, and those beans are getting placed into the application context. So from there, you can just do, there's a couple tests that you can do. I'm going to go ahead and paste these in here. But they will do a couple things, right? I want to make sure that there's a default base URL, right? I also want to check to see, hey, if I override that service, that base URL, I want to make sure that that is sticking. And then there's, hey, let's go ahead and make sure there's, oh, we didn't actually do any implementation in the client yet, which is fine. But I just want to see that those types of tests are working. So let's go ahead and run that. Cool. So those work. That's good. So if we go back to our to-do client, we're actually not doing anything yet. So let's just run, copy some code in. Again, copy pasta. This is not the point of this. We've done this JSON placeholder service with the REST client a couple times. So here's some methods in here. I want to call out to the service and find all or find one or create one. That's pretty typical of what we might do. So back in my test, let's go ahead and pull those other files back up. These methods are to go ahead and test that the JSON placeholder service is working. What are we complaining about here? Let's import that. So let's see if we can find all. The JSON placeholder service has 200 to-dos. So we are actually reaching out to it in this instance. And then we're double checking that the one that we get by its ID, that is working as well. So cool. So not a lot to it. That's kind of our base code for our starter. We did a couple things. We removed some of the boilerplate code that you would get with a Spring application. We created some properties, a configuration class. We are reading in that configuration class using this imports file, which is a convention, and then everything gets picked up from there. And we also saw how we can test some of this. So with this in mind, I think we're ready to use this in an application. So let's figure out how we can do that. All right, so I am here in my M2 directory. The project that we built is using Maven. So I'm looking in my local M2 repository here. I'm going to cd into repository, if we could spell, Dan. And then in here, all the different repositories. Again, mine is under dev.danvega. So I'm going to cd into dev.danvega. And if we look in here, we don't see anything about that JPS custom Spring Boot starter. So I'm going to go in here into my terminal. I'm going to say Maven clean install. And I'm just going to kind of force that. If everything goes okay, and it did, let's go ahead and ls again. And now we see a JPS. So if we go cd JPS, in here we have a JPS Spring Boot starter. And then the Spring Boot starter that we're going to have is based on this version. So this is the name, so JPS Spring Boot starter. And then the version is 0.0.1 snapshot. So if we go in here, we'll see there's a 0.0.1 snapshot. When we change that version number and do this again, there'll be a second version in there. So now that I know it's in my local repository, in my Maven repository there, when I go ahead to use it on my machine, now this is just my machine only, I can go ahead and include it as a starter in my dependencies block in another application. Now, what we aren't going to cover in this tutorial is how to publish this to Maven Central and so that everybody else can use it. We'll do that in a separate tutorial. But just for testing it out, I'm going to create a new Spring Boot project and use it here on my machine. All right, so here I have a simple application called Hello JPS. So in my PALM file, underneath whatever dependencies I've included in this, I'm going to say I want to bring in that dependency. So that dependency is going to be my JPS Spring Boot starter. That's going to come from dev.danvega, and the version, actually this is going to be .jps as well. And then the version is going to be 0.0.1 snapshot. So let's go ahead and refresh Maven, cross our fingers. Hopefully everything gets pulled in. I don't see any errors. If we go in here, we can see there is our starter. We can see that the code is there. And yeah, everything's looking good. So now what I want to do is actually use this in my application. So in my app, I might create a to-do controller. And in this to-do controller, I might say this is a REST controller with a request mapping of /to-dos. And in here, I might say that I need a instance of my JPS to-do client, right? So I have a to-do client. I'm going to get that through constructor injection. I'm going to have a get mapping to there to return to me a list of to-dos. And then we'll say this is find all. And all I'm going to do is use that JPS to-do client to find all of the to-dos. So now if I go ahead and run this application, if everything works out okay, looks like it is, I can go into a terminal. I can use a quick command line utility called http, whatever it is, and say 8080/to-dos, and hopefully we get 200 to-dos, and we do. And now that is using the custom Spring Boot starter. So now anytime in one of my demos, I just want to like grab a list of to-dos and use them for something, I have an example of that. So I can do that with all of the JSON placeholder service. Now I can expand that out to get people and comments and albums if I just need some like dummy data to play with. So I think that's it. Again, this was a pretty simple example of it. this isn't like the best way to do it. This isn't the most advanced way to do it. This is, we got to learn how to walk before we can run. As I mentioned at the beginning of this, there are probably ways that you can set this up a little bit different, having just the configuration in one project, having the code in another project. But I wanted to include it all in one just for simplicity's sake today. And also, there are probably some better examples that we could have done. One example that I want to get into is I use Notion a lot to, and I've connected Notion to my Spring apps before, but I've done this in a very manual way. And the second time that I started to do this, I realized, wow, I'm gonna have to like either like copy and paste all that code or like try to like figure out how to do that again. And that would be another reason to use a starter, right? Like we've used starters in all our applications as like building blocks for bigger applications. So when you start to notice that pattern, like I did with the Notion, that may be a good use case for creating your own custom starter. That's kind of one side of the thing. The other side might be just in your organization. You have common ways of doing things. And in that case, creating a starter for inside your organization is probably a really good idea. So, hey, I hope you learned something today. I thought this was really fun. There wasn't a lot of great info outside of the docs out there on how to do this. So I hope this is something you're interested in. If you are and you want us to keep going with this, let me know and we can come up with some other examples. Even pushing it to like Maven Central is probably a good idea. So, hey, I hope you learned something new today, friends. If you did, do me a favor, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always,